Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report. And it happened much sooner than I expected. I didn't expect there to be much of a fight put up in Afghanistan, but I mean, here we are. The Islamic Republic of Afghanistan has fallen as of the 15th, 16th, depending on what time zone you were in. Point being is just in the past couple days, the Taliban has reasserted power for the first time in just shy of 20 years in Afghanistan, just shy of the 20th anniversary of September 11th. And I believe, in a way, we all saw this coming. Now, the severity and how rapid it was, I don't think we saw coming. And I think the best place to start out with this is talking about the so called withdrawal of American presence
Yeah,
from Afghanistan. Now, I'm sure you've all seen the footage now, of course, because of the copyright overlords. I can't really play much of this, so I can't really play any of it, and I'm not going to take that chance. But the crowded runways with the American cargo planes taking off, the cargo planes packed to the brim, like double the capacity of people, the helicopters flying away from the embassy with the smoke of the classified files that they are burning. Many people comparing it, of course, to the fall of Saigon in South Vietnam in 1975, but there are a couple key differences. Number one, the U.S. military presence got out of Vietnam about 2 years prior, before the fall of Saigon. Number two, in no way was it this disorderly or just chaotic. The American military could still secure a runway. They could still get people out of the country efficiently. And it looks like in Afghanistan that clearly has not happened. Now, there's so much to go with it. We're going to cover all these points eventually, but there's just so many different directions you can take this whole thing. But it was both a real material defeat and a massive symbolic defeat. Now, I'd argue much more of a symbolic and rhetorical defeat than material, but it shows the organizational level of the U.S. military, of the U.S. government, of the people in charge of us. Now, Afghanistan was a, let's say, nebulous war, probably the best word for it, where, of course, you all know the official stories 9/11, looking for bin Laden and Al Qaeda leadership. We push in, we help the Northern Alliance take back the country using mainly special forces and air power rather than conducting an outright invasion with the proposed 60,000 troops marching in as a more or less conventional army, which was the original plan proposed in the Pentagon, which, had you not had plans to state and nation build, which of course they will vehemently deny now, including Biden himself, as we'll get into his wonderful withdrawal speech, it would have done the job. You would have crushed the Taliban government, you would have rooted out Al Qaeda, and had to hunt the remnants across the globe. As, again, they ended up in places like Pakistan, in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein, Syria after the Civil War, etc., and Libya after its collapse, but pretty much anywhere there was political instability. Somalia was another big target, another big hub of Al Qaeda. But again, you had this, of course, wonderful idea of we're going to give Afghanistan back to the people and we're going to rebuild it in our image, which means it turns out when you throw tribal Muslims out of power and put different tribal Muslims in power, not much changes except in the urban areas such as Kabul, where you have direct control and can actually force this sort of thing at gunpoint. Or, of course, as the joke goes, the president of Afghanistan was just a glorified position of the mayor of Kabul. The central government had no authority. It was a joke of an idea that it ever did. One could even argue that the Soviet-backed government had more central authority than, of course, the American regime. Not that that's saying much, not that the Soviet-backed government had that. And there's another comparison. The Democratic Republic of Afghanistan lasted 3 years after the withdrawal of the Soviet Union. It only collapsed shortly after the Soviet Union was unable to provide it funds because the Soviet Union itself had collapsed. We're looking at, well, over the course of 3 months since May 2021, when the withdrawal proceedings began, of the Taliban collapsing. Now, of course, these Afghan soldiers, these people part of the Afghan National Army, had no motivation to fight. And I don't even know why I'm bothering to do this because it's just going to
yeah.
be self-evident. Here's the map of
Well,
Afghanistan with the only area slightly under the control of Afghanistan government and NATO allies is still they considering some parts of Kabul, which I think is even a generous interpretation at this point. But the rest of the country is under the control of the Taliban to the point where they control more territory than, of course, they ever did prior to the U.S. invasion, and it is really something. Now, again, I will reiterate that since the beginning of the show, I've always thought getting out of Afghanistan was a good idea. Now, I realized that at the time, there was no clean way to do it, especially after the war crossed a decade mark, after Bin Laden was officially taken out and we were still there. It was pretty self-evident that there was going to be no clean withdrawal from Afghanistan. We almost had that opportunity in 2014, 2015 under Obama when, of course, we started the new mission in Afghanistan, which was less combat-oriented, but still a military presence in Afghanistan. And that's when a lot of the more social programs, social engineering, for example, funding academic feminism in Afghan universities, or setting up these so-called women's schools, which were used for one photo op before being turned into weapons depots by whatever faction was in power then. So, again, it goes back to this idea of trying to impose these ideas of an industrial, arguably post-industrial society, these Enlightenment liberal ideas that arose in very particular circumstances on people who still live ostensibly in, you could argue, even pre-medieval conditions, of course, barring a few things, but you look at some of these Afghan tribal villages, it's, for lack of a better term, Stone Age. Not much has changed since. It's a very primitive form of civilization, if you will, beyond, of course, their armaments, which, of course, it's not like they manufacture themselves, they capture whatever enemy. And then just exposure to technology is inevitable in the modern world, so you'll have some rudimentary technology, computers, cell phones, etc., but compared to most other even third world countries, for example, if you go somewhere like Zimbabwe is much more socially and economically developed than Afghanistan is, or even any of these other countries in Central Asia, such as Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan or Uzbekistan, or just neighboring Iran, neighboring Pakistan, not even to mention neighboring China. But just getting into all these various things. It's just society, for whatever reason, for whatever series of events, did not develop into even what we'd consider a third world society today. And really, the idea that, I mean, you can look at the way the Pentagon approached this. So this was never a war that was meant to be won. It was a war that was meant to be perpetual. And of course, in the hubris of the late 90s, early 2000s, we thought we could have this imperial stronghold for decades, if not centuries to come. Now, that very rapidly changed. They overstepped their bounds. They overestimated themselves quite a bit, in my opinion. I think probably your opinion and the opinion of most of our audience here. And we are looking at the consequences of that. Of course, the figure that gets thrown around is our average commanding officer, our average general in charge of the Afghanistan war, lasted less than a year because there was just shy of 20 years of war, and we went through roughly 23 commanders, I believe is the figure they throw around. But point being is, not enough time for any commander to really draw up a strategy. And again, you could argue that was deliberate. Of course, you get into the inter-service competition. These generals were out for their own careers rather than the broader goals in mind. And really, the consequences of these organizations like the military, like the CIA, like intelligence agencies, being more or less independently governed rather than under the authority of the United States government, or say even the president. I mean, as corrupt and nepotistic as many Arab governments are, you might think Saddam's Iraq, etc., there is more of a stability, in my opinion, when power of those sort of organizations, of course it can't be absolute power, no power can really be absolute, is placed in the hands of a single autocrat. I think you're honestly making a safer bet that way. I'm not saying that's the safest bet you could make. I think there's better ways to structure it than both of those, but I think it's certainly better to take your chances with one strongman in charge of all of these things than leaving them as independent rogue organizations, as we've seen from the past, I would say, past 70 years since the end of World War II, since the CIA was really founded. It was never really under the leash, never really under the control of the president or Congress or any of these organizations. They answered to no one, is what I'm getting at. And I think it culminates in wars like Afghanistan, arguably wars like Vietnam. These wars were there, but there's no real plan for victory. There's no real idea. It is strange because you look at the Gulf War, you look at Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. There was debate on whether we should push all the way into Iraq and depose of Saddam, but there was a war plan there to, at the very least, drive the Iraqi military out of Kuwait and end the Iraqi occupation, which we did swimmingly, which us and the coalition forces did swimmingly. Now, I hazard to guess if we can even pull off an operation like that today, but I would say a large part of the deterioration of the U.S. military goes down to the fact that, by doctrine, our interventions are meant to be perpetual. By doctrine, our wars are not to be meant to be won. You see this everywhere from Iraq to Libya to Syria to Afghanistan, well, formerly Afghanistan. And just the final point I'll put on this in particular is I would not have expected a timeline where Iraq was quote unquote more successful than Afghanistan. Now, from the American Empire's perspective, Iraq is more or less an Iranian proxy state with all the different groups they have there. So that was not successful. But you could even argue at this point, and I would, that Iraq was somehow more successful than the intervention in Afghanistan.
Yeah, to some degree. I think if, I have. I mean, like you said, there's a lot of directions where this could go, and I honestly think that in some ways the news is actually so bad that a lot of Americans, including Americans on the dissident right, are not are just coping right now. You know, there are people who are upset because some people on the dissident right think the Taliban is pretty good, like they did a good job. And my argument is, like, so what if they say that? Because the counter argument, which was such a bad take, was that, well, you see, Afghanistan and the U.S. are two very different places, and Afghanistan is, they're going back to normal now. They're going back to their historical model. Well, I mean, how many people on the dissident right think that Europe or America are normal right now? Right? You can make the argument that, well, this is the consequence of liberal Enlightenment thinking, and you could embrace the absurd conclusion, and I argue it's the only conclusion from liberal Enlightenment thinking.
And, well, I would say there's a dividing line even among people on our side, you could say, who maybe not even consciously, but even just subconsciously, still buy into the myth of liberalism to some degree, and the people who have no use for it. And those are more like the people like us, and that takes various different forms. People who think that, like, oh boy, there's no political solution, skull mask now, of course we're not that. Or the people who think, well, there's really nothing salvaging here, so you might as well hunker down and, find an escape plan, if you will. Now, whether that's a literal escape or just an escape from the system's ensnarement of you is another debate. But, again, I do think it goes down that way. And what I think you're touching at is, I think, whereas if you asked the distant right, the so-called distant right, upwards of 90% of them would have agreed that we should get out of Afghanistan. But I do think the stark reality, especially in the way that the withdrawal was conducted, most of them were not prepared for what it would look like. Most of them were not prepared for the reality of the situation. Now, maybe we're bragging here. Maybe I'm bragging here, but I would say we've been a bit ahead of the curve. And, going back to like 2019, early 2019, we always predicted that the end of the Afghan war would be the beginning of the end of the empire. It would be the beginning of Act 3 of the empire, if you will, that things would really start to go downhill once they called it quits in Afghanistan. And I think we're seeing that play out right now. We'll get into some other stuff that points to that, but again, I think a lot of people hadn't quite made that conclusion yet, so it took them off guard. And again, I think that's why people are so harsh about criticizing Biden at this particular moment, the current administration, and the conduct of the withdrawal. Like, I will fully admit that from an objective point of view, the withdrawal was horrible. It was botched horribly. I will also admit at that point, I don't think it would have mattered who would have been in office. I don't think it could have been done properly at that point. And number three, I'm not surprised by it. Like, seeing this news as it was unfolding, a lot of people were shocked, thinking like, oh, how could this happen? How could this happen with the United States military? How could this happen with the United States State Department? And I just look at this and it's like, well, that's just the inevitable conclusion of the past century, if not longer, isn't it? But in a more immediate sense, the past half century. This is what it was all leading up to, wasn't it? And that's at least the way I see it. I'd imagine you'd agree with me on that. But I think, and this is not to criticize them or their intelligence or anything, but I just didn't think that people who this may not be their main focus, hadn't made that connection yet in their mind until they actually saw it play out in real time.
Right. There's that. I think it's dawning on them. Right. But my point is, like, they have a visceral hate of these people that underlies their whole argumentation. So when they say, for instance, that the two countries are too different to make any kind of comparisons, and your global empire mind in America projects onto the far-flung territories under the empire and how they ought to live, and even when there's disputes in those territories, that they somehow reflect one-to-one with the situation at home. I don't think that's what was meant. Like, and I don't think that argument stands because, as you mentioned, Afghanistan is a petri dish for, the American, cathedral, the academic process, right? Women in Kabul could get their master's degrees in women's and gender studies, right? Like, don't talk to me about there wasn't nation building just because it sucked. Um, every single one of these presidents in Afghanistan were appointed. Every one of them was paid, right? All of this was paid for, right? That's not nation building, right? So very bad takes. The other is just not realizing that comparisons actually in this particular situation can be made. You can talk about just how deep and wide the chasm is between, let's say, rural Afghanistan and Kunduz and Kabul, right? But that chasm is also widening and getting deeper in the West between this left-right paradigm as well. I think that the left-right paradigm, as much as we hate it, is going to endure, and it will endure within, like, the notions of liberal ideology more than in other countries. So I think they're quite wrong about that. You know, take for instance the president. What's his name? Ghani or
It was like Ghani, who is currently
Ghani.
fled to the
So
United Arab Emirates. Just that little news update, which is ironically enough, apparently where the Taliban leadership was hiding out most of the war. So it really does make you question the true depth of the involvement of the Gulf states, especially when you tie that back to Osama bin Laden and Saudi Arabia, which that just adds a whole new dimension to it, doesn't it?
yes. So uh, his people talk about Biden's speech was very, very misleading. It was kind of monotone, but very well executed. And stupid Biden shills like Richard Spencer, of course, couldn't wait to own the MAGA peds for it. He's got this long-standing, I don't know, rivalry against them. And what's interesting to me in that speech is, first of all, Biden is gaslighting, and Blinken did it too when he was talking to Chuck Todd and Jake Tapper. That there was no way to get out, and the people wanted an end to the war. It's like people are talking about the execution of the withdrawal, right? And now, there was a very subtle thing that both Biden and Blinken did. This was very well rehearsed. And that was to talk about extending the due date from May 1st, right, into the summer season. And this will tie in with the Afghan president Ghani that disappeared. So the Taliban does not fight very hard in the winter. The Americans, if they had left, so that is, if the evacuation had started in April, when it's still rainy and cold, particularly in the mountains and so on, if that had happened, right? You would have had arguably a better withdrawal. But the fact is they withdrew during the height of fighting season. Now, one of the reasons they probably extended it was the bad information. And America understands that the very people that they pay, so it's not like the incompetence of America is far, far greater than the incompetence of the people that they hire. Ghani was an anthropologist. He was a professor in a I think at where was it at you at Columbia. It was in a New York university. Okay,
Yeah,
so
something
he
like
gave
that.
yes. So um, what he was doing was giving them information that they weren't, the Taliban isn't really that successful because he was milking the system for all it was worth. He was getting all the money that he could, right? And that's why he extended it right down, to the deadline, right? And what did he do? He escaped with a helicopter and 3 cars filled with money. He even had to leave money behind at the airport because he couldn't fit it in.
Should have traded in for Bitcoin.
Right. So so by extending the deadline, in fact, Biden made it worse. Biden has been capable of undoing Trump's policies when he has seen fit to do that, particularly with the border wall and Mexico and all of that stuff. He's particularly good at it when he wants to. And this idea that he could not intervene with what Ghani was doing in Afghanistan is complete. It's completely bogus. It's bullshit, right? Because when they installed Yatsenyuk as the replacement president of Ukraine, and their head prosecutor, which would have been like the equivalent of Mueller in charge of the FBI, was investigating the Biden family and their ties to Burisma, particularly Biden's son. Okay, Biden on air like literally said, I told him you're going to fire that son of a bitch in the next 6 hours, or I'm not leaving, and you're not getting the money, 1 billion.
Oh, don't even get
No,
started on Ukraine yet, because, oh boy, we got a lot of news about the credibility of
so
the American empire that we're going to get into, but do continue.
right, so he had the option, he didn't do it. Right, this was this was an unmitigated disaster. Everybody, and it will follow him. Um, I would say in some circles, Biden will be known for this. You notice at the press conference, no one was there. Kamala wasn't there. Nobody was there. He
Yeah,
took
circle back to
no.
Sky took the week off.
Jen Psaki is gone on vacay. He's gone back to vacay. He literally went there for like a presser for less than an hour, and went home.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Because
I made that joke the other day that people were like, "Oh, where's Biden at?" And I said, "Oh, he's clearly at his Crimean beach house." And no joke, he was at Camp David, and really I know I've made the parallels between him and Trump more, but it was very ham-fistedly. I know no better comparison to make at this time. A Gorbachev moment. A leader missing in action at the helm of a dying empire at a losing war. Now, people have been making the Soviet Union comparison, which I do think is pretty fair in this case, especially in the light of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, about how Soviet Union collapsed in late '91 after withdrawing in early '89. So maybe we only have 2.5 years left as a country. Now, I think it's hard to gauge those sort of things with all the different circumstances. But I do think one angle I want to approach, and I think you were sort of getting at this, was this the purpose of Biden? Will he be cast aside now? Will they implement the 25th Amendment where his cabinet says he's clearly not mentally fit to hold this office anymore and he must be removed and the vice president must be installed? Of course, the 25th Amendment was what they were trying their damnedest to push on Trump, but that, of course, didn't work. And some people have speculated that they put in the kooky old man, the, of course, allegedly senile old man, so they could use him to rip this band-aid off, to make this tough decision, and then cast him aside and blame it on his dementia. Now, people have speculated, other people have speculated, some, which I did see this at first, and I did have, of course, the overreaction that, well, Biden just sent several thousand more troops to Afghanistan. Now, in that, of course, that was for the evacuation, and I don't think there's any plans to stay in Afghanistan, especially at this point. I think even if we wanted to, that door had been shut, and it'll be a while, if at all, if we can return to Afghanistan. And the other point I want to touch on is during Biden's speech, of course, he said, well, yeah, this war's got to end, and we can't just keep on fighting Afghanistan when the people have no will themselves to fight there, which I do think was ostensibly a good point. It sounds like something that Trump would have said. And he also made the compelling point that he's like, we can't keep wasting money in this black hole when we have to confront other rivals such as Russia and China, which does lend credence to the idea that we are abandoning Afghanistan to gear up for further escalation in East Asia or Europe. Now, the funny thing about that is particularly with Taiwan. Taiwan has lost a great deal of confidence in the U.S., and you see them making moves to try to address that. There is speculation, of course. One of the more out there theories was China has already invaded Taiwan and that it's more or less over. The Ukrainians were not feeling very confident today. You had Macron come out and say that the European Union will stand firm on the migrant crisis and we're not going to let any more in light of what is likely going to happen. Some of the stuff we touched at the end of last episode on with the impending French and German elections, and of course, French elections coming up sooner, that being April of 2022, so about 9.5, 10 months from now. So it looks like Europe is gearing up for that. And the other piece of news when it comes to speaking of NATO allies was I saw this interesting piece. So Russian journalists, so take it with a grain of salt, take it how you will, report that 12 Ukrainian soldiers were left behind at an American base in Kabul. They knew nothing of the evacuation. All Americans were evacuated, and there were 40 left behind, including Georgians, Romanians, and Bulgarians. So you had these smaller NATO countries and these aspiring NATO countries who chipped in Afghanistan, did their part, sent small contingencies of troops to make up where the U.S. or coalition forces were weak. You see that Eastern European countries do this all the time, and these smaller European countries do this all the time. For example, Poland was one of the 4 countries that actually participated in the invasion of Iraq, where, again, of course, during the initial invasion of Afghanistan, you had the big players, U.S., UK, France, Germany, etc. But then they're bolstered by these small countries trying to gain favor of the U.S. And continuing on to this day, you saw that these small contingencies were probably there, not serving that much of a combat role, maybe advisory role to local troops or whatever purpose they served there, being more or less abandoned by the master they are trying to please, which some people are speculating that this entire withdrawal in both Eastern and Western Europe will be a blow to American credibility, a blow to NATO credibility, and I do think with some of the maneuvering we saw with Macron, at least on the migrant crisis, this could be the case, and I think one of the more interesting figures to watch over these next few weeks will be Macron and what he has to say in light of this. Not only related to Afghanistan, but just his conduct in diplomacy on the international stage in general. How he's going to go forward as the president of France and de facto leader of the European Union. And I do think that will be very telling on the direction Europe is going, whether they're going to try to close rank and try to maintain the current American order, or whether they're going to continue on the path they have been going down, which has been more of a disassociation with the United States. And again, China is another big one to watch. They've more or less come to agreements with the Taliban. But I do think, and this is in light of more recent news, the Northern Alliance flag has been raised in Afghanistan for the first time since the Taliban was in power before the 2001 invasion. And of course, the Northern Alliance were the groups that were holdout when the Taliban first took power, and the ones who really waged the initial guerrilla war against them, the ones who pushed down with American support. And what I am thinking right now is we're seeing the stage being set for Iran actually to make its foothold in Afghanistan, similar to the way they did in the U.S. disaster in Iraq, where, of course, you had the uprising of the counterinsurgency in Iraq, the withdrawal of American forces, and all that time Iran was bolstering positions there, supporting militias, sending in the IRGC. But I just have a hunch, and I think time will tell, that the IRGC is going to have a lot of fun in Afghanistan against the Taliban right now because, of course, they said that the Taliban coming to power was an opportunity to bridge the gap, an opportunity for peace. I'm sure that the Iranian leadership is happy to have American troops out, but I'm sure they're also pretty displeased that the Taliban back in power, no matter how much they may have reformed some of their previous positions. So I wouldn't be surprised if you hear murmurings of Iranian-backed groups and IRGC operating in, again, the northern parts of Afghanistan in these, even just these next few months, of course, just in a broader sense than these next few years.
Well, I mean, Iran in a way has to be careful because uh, they don't really want to strike the ire of China in this scenario.
Oh, of course,
Uh,
and but I
After all, China is giving them loads of money right now for their infrastructure project. It's been hard for them to find. There literally is no other partner who can give them any kind of money. So, um, in a way, they cannot be responsible for reigniting the civil war in Afghanistan. There's some other things that should be mentioned, about the Taliban, and that is, there's now, of course, when they say under Sharia law, like women will get an education, it's not going to be a Western education, but it's less severe than what they were suggesting 20 years ago. Number two, they're also becoming more media savvy. They literally had like a live video conference on Al Jazeera, and they were asked about free speech, to which they retorted, "You're asking us about free speech? U.S. companies like Facebook, who claim to promote free speech, are still censoring people. So they know their talking points. It's a sophisticated group. They're also giving amnesty to all the people that collaborated with the U.S. Like, the U.S. killed 51,000 civilians, right? You saw the headlines through the years, woman killed after giving birth, hospital kills 19, pine nut farm blown up, 19 dead, like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Lots of that kind of stuff. Actually, that one with the pine nut farmers was 30 dead. So what I'm saying is so far they're not behaving the way, let's say, the West and particularly the U.S. wants them to behave. This was pretty bloodless. There was not a lot of killing in order to take over Kunduz, Mazar-e Sharif, and Kabul, of course, right? I remember seeing an interview with Engel and Chuck Todd, and they're already putting the scare, right? Now, I'm not predicting what's going to happen. I'm simply saying that I think they want a very different kind of outcome of their rise to power, right? And some of the things, like, definitely they are going to stop the poppy production for heroin. That's one of them. The other is like the ridiculous botcha, whatever you call it, the essentially the raping of boys, the botcha bazi, which has been in that region prior to Islam. That's going to be outlawed as well. Remember, the Taliban actually gave these boys guns to kill the men who were raping them. And often these guys were like warlord leaders, and they were sometimes police chiefs or policemen. And they literally gave them guns to just finish these guys off. So we're not seeing the kind of transition and the kind of horror stories. To date, now there have been people who have been killed, but the only confirmed death so far at the hands of the Taliban has been an ISIS member. So, a few weeks back when we were talking about Afghanistan, I mentioned that they have a much wider coalition than they did before. And I think they're sincere as much as possible, as much as they can maintain cohesion. I think their leadership is sincere about trying to find some kind of a middle ground, not necessarily between America and Afghanistan and whatever it is that the Taliban wants. No, some kind of a middle ground between international expectations, the expectations of China, and expectations within Afghanistan itself, as diverse as it is, right? Um, so I we're going. Let's see what happens. So far, the bloodbath that everybody was expecting would happen. Like the ISIS videos where they get all these men on their knees as they shoot them from behind. Uh, you know, God forbid beheadings and so on and so on. We haven't seen that, right? That's what everybody expected, and that is what the U.S. and the West want now that they're leaving.
Oh, of course. And again, I do agree with you that it's going to be a tightrope, and that with the Taliban's quote unquote rebranding, it's probably going to be less of a severe situation. And I think the crux of this will be Pakistan, which of course that plays in their relations with China. But I do think more or less for the first time since the 1970s, Afghanistan might have a, dare I say, stable government under the Taliban. And of course, again, it's more or less a similar name. And as you were saying, they're not going to be what they were in the 90s or up until 2001 with
Mhm.
the very traditional, very made traditional, not the way word, but the very fundamentalist Islam that ruled the country up until, of course, the American invasion, and that in many parts of the country still has not fallen out of power. And that's been the thing about Afghanistan, where really, of course, we had to control these major urban areas, but the minute American or coalition troops left these villages, they were right back on the Taliban side. Taliban leaders would go into hiding. Locals would say, "No idea what you're talking about. We're loyal to the central government." And again, it would continue on that way. A game of perpetual whack-a-mole, if you will. And really, again, not to, uh, I know I'm probably going to get some heat for this, but it does
Mhm.
go back to the point that when the Soviet Union that was there, they were much more merciless than the Americans were in their conduct in terms of who they were willing to take out and what sort of collateral damage they were willing to risk. Not that, of course, the Americans were too careful with collateral damage, but point being is they more or less had the goal of putting the country to the sword, whereas the U.S. tried to do this hearts and minds thing it's been trying to do since Vietnam, which hasn't succeeded a single time, mind you. But again, and that also gets into the absurdities of these interventions. Some places are just black holes. Some places you will just not come out of unless
Mhm.
it looks like this. And really, I mean, it's still wild to see these pictures coming out of it. And again, I think Saigon is the apt comparison, but I do think it was worse than Saigon. For example, if you've seen that video of that again cargo plane on the runway with people swarming
Yeah.
it trying to get on board, to the point where they couldn't secure the single runway, to the point where the airport was under siege and they couldn't get aircraft to take off. Again, burning the classified documents. All of this, again, if we're going with the Soviet Union comparison, again, they had a very orderly and quiet withdrawal, which is what I was expecting from the United States when we saw how we abandoned Bagram Air Base and some of the earlier bases we evacuated. It was very quiet, very conspicuous. We were just gone over the night without the commanders even knowing, the local Afghan commanders even knowing. But this has been turned into a complete clown show. This has been turned into an international embarrassment. And really, I think piled on top of everything else, there isn't much room to recover from this. I don't think there's much room to build back better, so to speak. And
Yeah.
again, I still wonder, is this going to be the end of Biden? Is this going to be he served his purpose? It's time for President Harris. And we were talking about on the show a few months back about how Trudeau got caught saying something about how he didn't expect Biden to be in much longer. I think the latest date they gave was
Yeah.
the 2022 congressional elections, where they expected Biden to be pretty much out of office either because he croaks or he steps down or is forced out because of
Mhm.
age and health. Of course, it's all speculation, but Again, maybe it's accelerating a bit earlier. For example, if Biden suffered a quote unquote health crisis tomorrow or stepped down because of X, Y, or Z reason, or the 25th Amendment was invoked. I'm not saying I expect it to happen, but I wouldn't be shocked in the slightest. And again, it seems like they are gearing up. I do think they realize what a disastrous withdrawal this is, and it does put them in a catch 22 sort of situation because, as I was saying, you had that news out of Taiwan, you had that news out of Ukraine, and all these other countries that had lost confidence in the U.S. And there's the thing, of course, there's going to be this desire to want to reassert ourselves to prove that we're still strong, we can still play with the big boys, we can still stand up to Russia and China, but I don't see the opportunity, and I also don't see where we would or how we would do it. Again, I don't think the American people have the stomach for it. And the general attitude of the withdrawal is that of apathy. Now, keep in mind, this is, in at least most recent American history, probably the most supported war we had outside of, probably even more than World War II. You look at some of the early numbers in 1941 when we were first debating getting involved in the war before Pearl Harbor. I mean, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, of course, this was a very popular war. I can't think of any major names in Congress who dissented, or any real major names who dissented to the initiation of the war.
Mhm.
And the idea that just shy of 20 years later, in August of 2021, again, just almost 20 years later, you were to tell somebody hopped up on that post 9/11 patriotism that it's going to take us 20 years to get out of Afghanistan, it's going to be a complete failure, and most people are going to be completely apathetic to all of that information, they wouldn't have believed you. They would have said, "What the hell are you talking about? Why are you bashing America?" Of course, just like within the post 9/11 atmosphere, that is how that sort of comment would have been interpreted. But we're looking at a situation now where, with what it is, even a lot of the people who you'd expect to be more patriotic, even a lot of the veterans who fought in this war, a lot of them are saying, well, I could have seen that coming from a mile away. And you do talk to a lot of people who operated on the ground in Afghanistan saying, like, well, yeah, it was pretty obvious that once we got out of there, this entire thing was going to fall apart. And again, of course, opinions do
Yeah.
vary across the spectrum, but I would say out of maybe Iraq, slightly more. But you talk to these guys who are in Afghanistan, they will pretty much say, like, yeah, we had no real reason to be there. That was pretty much a waste of time, money, effort, and blood. And really, I do think this is probably the epitome of what we've been hitting at for about the past year now of apathy. Again, even though most, I would say, okay, let's say we got out 10 years ago after bin Laden was taken out, but there was still no real improvement in Afghanistan. Again, at that point, people still questioned, like, what are we accomplished? But if we got out on the high of bin Laden being taken out and the good feelings of that, people would have probably still admitted that, like, okay, it was a fruitless war. We didn't get much, if anything, out of it. But it would have been less embarrassing. People probably would have supported getting out. But again, there would have been this sense of regret that we couldn't have done more, or that we, again, more or less lost the war. But we're at this point where a lot of the edgier people and people, like, of course, online will joke about, like, oh, it's a good thing the Taliban won, defeated the globalist empire. Again, and then there's probably the other opinion ranges like, well, who cares? What's really changed in Afghanistan? And that's the opinion I've always gone back to, where you'll see a lot of these people just get up in arms about, well, what about women's rights in Afghanistan? They're going to enforce Sharia law. And again, I go back to this point all the time. Outside of Kabul, except in a few villages that had coalition occupation, which didn't usually last very long, how much of life really changed in Afghanistan over the past 40 years? And not even the threat of war, because, of course, between the Soviet Union, the incurring civil war, and the American invasion, they had to contend with those threats. But again, for about 95% of Afghanistan, I would say, at least area wise, life hardly changed in the slightest. Again, there may have been a girls' school built for a photo op in your village, but I mean, how functional do you think it was? How many students do you think it actually had? Whereas a lot of the social experimentation happened in Kabul, and even though it was ridiculous, even though it was a waste of U.S. resources and a mockery of, again, the concept of a military there to fight a war, it was more so these things were just photo ops that were turned into arms depots after, again, they got the first class of schoolgirls or whatever, ex minority group or whatever through it. And again, I think the other big angle of this was the amount of equipment that we had lost in the country because, of course, it was a very rapid withdrawal. You see these photo ops of Taliban with these, advanced U.S. weapons, whether that just be again small arms such as rifles, handguns, and grenade launchers, all the way to things like helicopters, which you have these pilots who were trained by the U.S. in the Afghan National Army who defect to the Taliban because that's more or less what most of the army did, or just went home. And of course, these people are at least semi-competently trained pilots. But one other angle you got that was interesting was a lot of military equipment was taken in a refugee convoy to places like Iran, to places like Tajikistan, places like Pakistan. I don't know if anyone went to China. I think the path to China probably would have been a bit more narrow, but more impassable. But again, the point being is you have just these caches of high-tech U.S. weaponry and equipment laying around the country and being transported into neighboring countries. So the Taliban's going to be armed to the teeth for years to come. The countries of the region are going to be armed to the teeth for years to come. And really, just looking at that, and it wasn't even a scorched earth policy where maybe we could have done some missile strikes on our own depots just to keep this stuff from falling into enemy hands. I mean, we've done those sort of things before, destroy our own equipment instead of them getting it. But it looks like we were just so apathetic to the point that we were just looking to get out, and really, it's just I'm still shocked. I'm sure you can tell just by the way I'm presenting
Mhm.
myself this show that it happened this way. And again, I'm not even like baying for blood. I'm not even saying, oh, we left too soon, that this is a complete disaster. No, at this point, I'm at a weird crossroads between apathy and shock. Like, I couldn't care less. I figured this is probably going to be inconsequential in a lot of ways. I think there's going to be very few ways it's going to be significant. Now, those few ways are going to be pretty pivotal, for example, such as our standing on the world stage and just the American people's confidence in the regime. But really, in terms of on the ground in Afghanistan and what we accomplished, there's not really much you can say. And I I I, I
Well,
have
I
a
mean, I
feeling
think
the media is going to try to shut this up over the next few weeks, but it's just going to be something that lingers on. And I'm curious how this will affect, of course, the 20th anniversary of 9/11. What is the media narrative going to be around this? What is the cultural narrative going to be around this? How are we going to address this? The first anniversary of 9/11, which just so happens to coincide with the 20th anniversary, where American presence is gone, and I think it will actually be a sense of finality, whereas every year with the memorial services and the attitudes there, it feels like an ongoing thing because this presence has continued. But it certainly marks the end of a chapter in American history, and I think we're turning over to even a much darker chapter, as you touched on, as we've touched on over the past few years now. And really, I will say my more optimistic side says there's plenty of opportunity to be had with all of this, but I do think things are going to go downhill much faster than I was even initially anticipating at the beginning of this year, or even beginning of like 2020 or 2019.
yeah, I mean, we kind of touched on this on the last show, and that is okay. So there will probably be. I mean, they're clamoring for the refugees, and the question is now the argument for them, of course, uh, just from an optics point of view, with that runway and those men sitting on the wheel assembly of that jet, and then later falling to their death afterwards, is of course going to be pivotal in order to to argue for refugees to come in. And that's why I made my point earlier that the violence and bloodbath that everybody was expecting isn't there, but the argument, in order to bring in more refugees into Europe and the US, but particularly it'll be Europe, will still go on. That is a much higher priority for them. And you can have a moratorium, a kind of like examine like all the stupidities of the West and the liberal class in Afghanistan. In many ways, they treat it as like uh, basically a societal mindfuck to see how it would work out in Western countries. Like I'll give you an example. In 2017, two Americans, an unconventional lyricist named Charlie Sohn and composer Tim Rosser created a musical about Afghans would consider too sensitive and unsettling. Of course, these brave guys in the U.S. didn't think so. So this musical was called "The Boy Who Danced on Air," and it's the love story of a bocce boy and another bocce boy. You see that? You see subtly how that goes. Like the big bad older guy, he's out of the. But like at least the bocce boys are still gay. They're completely projecting probably their own life experiences, probably Hollywood parties with Milo. Like literally, that's what. And they made hay out of it, right? Like their programs reached into villages where they tried to dump this stuff. And as I said, it just made them more rebellious and made them hate them more. And I think actually the Taliban right now is more magnanimous than the U.S. government is with the January the 6th protesters who are locked up. I mean, they just gave these people amnesty that were like, in their eyes, bombing them, killing them, many times just innocent people, trying to change their entire culture. Like literally, like when you do nation building, you're kind of searching for the dregs of that society, because like they're the ones that will work, for the big money to undermine the entire country.
Yeah,
Or
and
who
it sort
have
of goes back
a
to,
chip on their
again,
shoulder.
I know a lot of you are going to cringe at me saying this, what Yuri Bezmenov said. Now, I will say, insofar as
Yeah.
what he said was happening where it was wrong, but his analysis was accurate. It wasn't anything, I would say, spectacular. It wasn't anything groundbreaking, but he gives a pretty good analysis of how you break a society. And I do think, ironically enough, that's actually most reflected in American nation building, where, again, you demoralize the population, you put your people in power, you put your ideological foot soldiers in power to spread those ideas, and it takes a generation to subvert a country. And I would say, funny enough, we actually took that idea, which more or less, admittedly did originate in the Soviet Union, and applied that to, or at least tried to apply that to places like Afghanistan, Iraq. You could even go about as far back as South Vietnam, or again, or even more successfully, places like Germany or South Korea. I mean, you want to talk about social experiments. You want to talk about mass social experiments. Let's talk about post-war Germany in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And it continues to this day. Pretty much anything you see in the West now, we've outsourced that to a lot of these third world countries. For example, Africa. You get some of the stuff about, like, especially the quote unquote medical humanitarian aid in Africa, with how botched that is, and again the military interventions in the Middle East. But pretty much throughout the Cold War, and even slightly after the Cold War, I would argue today, even with some of the COVID stuff, Germany to this day is still a testing ground for what they want to do to Western societies and to America in general. It's the place where they put in these things, they interject these ideas in the population, and the big one you could go to is pornography in the late 40s and early 50s in post-war
Yeah.
Germany, and again, just the amount of what you could pretty much call American commissars there, where if you wanted to publish anything in the media, whether that be a book, newspaper article, uh, anything you'd want to show on TV or a movie theater, it had to get past the American commissars who said this is acceptable. Of course, it usually had to include just the right amount of German guilt that, like, oh, we're so sorry for this horrible war and these atrocities we've committed on the world. Will you please forgive us, rest of the world? Will we beg and grovel at your feet? Ironically enough, while the Soviet Union may have been more physically brutal and, again, employed things such as labor camps or deportations or executions in East Germany, you could say the long-term damage to Germany much more came from the American, for lack of a better term, psychological warfare rather than just the brute force. And I think that's the big dividing line between the two blocks of the Cold War, and I do think it comes down to the psychology of, for example, Eastern Europeans, Russians, versus Western Europeans, people of Western extraction, particularly in the Anglosphere, where in the Anglosphere they want to play this mind subversion game. They want to make you bow down to their ideas, Whereas again, you go further east, you get past what's that old Zizek quote? What river does he reference? What isn't the Danube? He says,
Oh
on this
yeah,
side,
yeah,
the women are beaten and
yeah.
whatever, and then they
Despotism.
don't like it, and then east of it they like it, blah blah blah. But pretty much, I would say, all joking aside, it goes back to two mentalities of those civilizations or subsets of civilization, where one is brute force, you do what we say, or you face severe consequences, or other ones like, well, you really want to do this, trust us. We'll convince you. Look, we're doing this for your own good. You're gonna like this. And again, it goes back into two ways to control society. And one could argue, I wouldn't go that far because I think it's too disparate with the place it was implemented to really be compared. That perhaps it's better to do something just under threat of force than, again, I think there's much longer lasting terms with the psychological warfare conducted on the like western part. And the ultimate point I'm getting at is you saw this in Afghanistan, you saw this play out, and again, just touching on the points you made there, it's these people are guinea pigs. Of course, they do want them to submit, but they're testing them for more important populations, so to speak.
Right. So, in other words, um, the reason militia groups are infiltrated by the FBI very quickly, no matter how numerous, is because they understand Afghanistan. Right. So, in other words, you can make many one-to-one comparisons, um, even if there are other important differences to distinguish. Right. Um, and we should also think about like what the victory will do for the world. In other words, it will definitely energize lots of groups. It will, I believe, it will energize right-wing groups in America and in the West. I think it will definitely energize various other, let's say, Islamic Sunni factions. That it's possible. Uh, let's not forget that the kind of funding that the Mujahideen received from the U.S. was astronomical compared to what the Taliban have. There's no big donors to the Taliban. Okay, their arms are even less sophisticated, uh, and they managed to just outweight, uh, their rivals.
Yeah, they tried to
You know,
cope really hard by saying the Russian bounties or Russian support, but even they came out and said, "Oh yeah, we were wrong about that," which means, "Hey, we lied about that." And so it was
yes,
the point where, okay, A, it gives you the opportunity to pin this on a foreign power. B, it makes it look less embarrassing because, look, a major rival is supporting these people. But even they couldn't keep up that ruse. And
yeah.
again, I think you make the good point about that. And I will pose a question for you, just like in this general ballpark um, of America's image on the international stage. Now, of course, I don't see like the organization officially dissolving tomorrow. I see it still existing on paper. But do you think, especially after this point, I would argue before this point, that NATO is a defunct organization? That NATO, if anything were to happen in Eastern Europe or anywhere in Europe involving, for example, a non-NATO country, probably Russia, that they would do anything? Or do you think it is functionally a dead organization at this point? Because I would say it is. I would say confidence has been completely lost probably before this point. But I think, for example, if Russia marched into let's just say really out there, the big fear mongering, Russia does march into the Baltic states. Do you think NATO would do anything at that point? I don't think they would.
Uh, Maybe not right away, but I think they would. I think Europe is too important for them. I do. Um, how would they go about it? I think one of the reasons that may lead people to believe that NATO wouldn't respond is because Russia wouldn't do it. I do think that. I think deep down inside, people know that Russia isn't going to do it. That the way states and people organize themselves now compared to the 19th century, and in many ways, the first half of the 20th century was really about expunging everything of the previous century from it. That is one of the reasons why we had like such catastrophic losses in these two world wars. The machinery had changed, but the ferocity and the fighting and the extent that people would go to was something from a previous era. The American Civil War in terms of fatalities and modern the modernization of weaponry is definitely a forecast of World War I in that regard, right? So I would say that America is better prepared to defend Europe from Russia, but they're not prepared to defend Taiwan.
Fair. I
That
think
I
East Asia is probably the weaker front, strangely enough, with the big
Yeah,
pivot to Asia. I do think they would draw a more solid line in the sand in Europe and maybe the Baltic states, which again I do think is outlandish. The idea that Russia's going to try to invade them at this point, like again, we're dealing with some sort of like 19th century imperialism. Again, that's at least for now. That's a dead idea. I don't know. Maybe even just further entrenchment into Ukraine with the little green men or these plausibly deniable things. But point being is, I I do think NATO as an organization, as a defense pact centered particularly around the United States, has lost a lot of credibility. And barring a few, again, outright major events, for example, like the actual conventional invasion of a member state, that is for all intents and purposes a defunct organization. I will clarify and I will say that is the position I'm putting out there.
yeah. I mean, there have been voices. The Times had an article yesterday by William J. Hague saying that the Taliban's victory in Afghanistan is a humiliation for the West, but it must not deter us from future military inventions. I mean, having to state that is in itself significant. But I think basically what we're seeing now, when we touched on this on the last episode, is how many more cycles of wars and refugees are people willing to take? Because someone is going to have to house them, and they're going to have to pay for them, right? Uh, Israel is already suggesting migratory routes and how they can help and facilitate this, of course. Um, but I'm saying there is a limit, and they know that this will fuel the populist right in Europe. They're trying to find ways to curtail that, and I think that's another reason why there's going to be, COVID lockdowns for a while. That is a measure. Um, Nonetheless, with all that said, I think that they're looking weak, and in a way, the victory is going to um, it's going to ignite a lot of passion in groups that are interested in either changing America from within or battling America elsewhere.
I would certainly say so, and I think it does. I think you've said all that you can say about that in a much more succinct way than I could. But just, I generally, when it comes to this show, have a general forecast of when I look at a topic of at least one tentative future prediction, or even a few. But when it comes to Afghanistan and the absolute fallout of this, I mean, I was I'll tell you the truth. I was anticipating the show for quite some time. I thought it would have been towards the end of this year, beginning of next year, when we actually had to put pen to paper on the show. So,
Yeah,
if you noticed I'm repeating and rambling a lot of things, it's because this caught me off guard. I will fully admit. But
yeah, me too.
it is. I wouldn't even know where to begin to speculate. Not only on the internal situation of Afghanistan, which I have a generally pretty good idea that Afghanistan is going to be a tribal Muslim society ruled by the Taliban that's much more open to cooperation, for example, with, say, China. But when it comes to the fallout of, again, America's reputation, of the refugee crisis, of all the things that have been tossed around and speculated, of the future of the Biden administration, I will admit, beyond very vague statements, I am more or less at a complete loss for this, and I do think more dust will have to settle. We may have to do a second episode this week, and just as a heads
Hmm.
up, um, tentatively, Vile Varangian is scheduled for the weekend after this one, so for the end of August he will be on. I, again, we'll see when we can get him in particular and hopefully announce a solid date next episode, but I'm just going to put that out there for now. But really, what I have right now, the only solid emotion I can put to this is, in a strange way, like just overall pessimism. Now, I do think that the Empire taking its blows, considering the fact what the Empire has done for us, or more appropriately, has done to us, I do think in one way or another this system has to be humbled, has to be brought to its knees. Of course, in a non-violent way. I've never advocated any violence or revolution against the system. Never do such a thing. Of course, as always, I advocate for apathy. Just simply do not engage. Just simply stay away from these people as much as is humanly possible. Just put that qualifier out there. But again, I do fundamentally think it's good that the Empire has gotten this much egg on its face, but it is thinking about it, speculating about it, talking about the long term greater good is one thing versus the immediate consequences. Now, I don't think this will have any immediate consequences in terms of how life is conducted in America. Now, I do think the subsequent events, the chain reaction of this, will. Some people speculate that the war on terror is quote unquote coming home. I could see that. I don't think it would go that far
Yeah.
just yet. I do think we need something a lot more major than the Capitol Hill debacle to justify that, because even in the minds of the public, it's just not that rousing. They would need a pretty good, definitely not a false flag incident in order to justify something like that. But I could see them going that way, or at least maybe not like, boots on the ground Afghanistan veterans patrolling the streets, but in terms of just focusing on the internal state of the empire, trying to mend internal divisions, whether that may be through softer means or through harder means, time will tell. But I do think that the American regime, the Biden administration, the people in charge of the cathedral, whatever the hell you want to call them, the deep state, are looking at the situation put in front of them right now and saying that if we don't get our shit together at home, there isn't going to be any more foreign intervention to be had. We won't have an empire to kick
Right.
down people's doors. And I think it's a too little too late kind of realization. I go back to this point all the time with Trump's foreign policy and Michael Flynn and his diagnosis of America's position on the world stage and how they're pretty much trying to haphazardly implement a lot of his ideas. Again, think what you will about him. I do think he got a lot of the diagnoses right about that. But again, I do think that I think it's a dark day in Washington right now. I don't think many people are feeling optimistic. I don't even think this sort of thing like where even the people on top are saying like, haha, we may have lost here, but we won here. But I see no conceivable way that any sort of victory is picked up for the vampiric neoliberal ruling class or whatever the hell you want to call them. And I think they're going to be desperately scrambling, maybe not in a military sense, but just in any sort of sense, doing something that will make them either look A, good, moral, and virtuous, or B, strong and not to be messed with. And who knows what those two things will be? It'll probably be a combination of the two. I expect probably more so on A side because it's probably going to be more palatable to the American public. But again, I go back to this point all the time. I've been talking about this the last few weeks. I don't think there is a single event that could happen, even a 9/11 style event, that could create some sense of unity in this country. I think any sort of event like that is actually more liable to pull us further apart as distrust in the regime continues to grow. And again, I would say we probably won't see the realities of it play out for a while, even though, I might have to, swallow my words on that one considering my predictions about Afghanistan. But I think it is more or less a checkmate of the American empire. I generally think between not just this, but everything that has happened over the past 20 years, and
Yeah.
particularly the past 5 years, we're painted into a corner. There's literally nowhere to
Yeah.
go. Unless we, visiting one of your old predictions, we do conduct tactical nuclear strikes, unless we're willing to do that madman strategy where we'll say, well, yeah, we'll drop a small megaton bomb on X, Y, or Z just to show that we're serious. I could see it coming to that. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but that pretty much, barring that, we're painted into a corner.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought out the let's say the domestic side of the theory that we're proponing about why this is a checkmate situation, and American projection of power will not be the same. The most that they can hope for is to target a country in the same way we said this last episode, in the same way that they did with Libya, and that's it. That's it. Um, you know, it is that's basically to wreck it, in order that it's not usable for anybody to take advantage of, meaning America's global competitors.
But even seeing it
And
in Syria, that doesn't always work because they tried the exact same thing there.
that's
Russia and
right.
Iran step in,
Yeah.
more or less stabilize the situation. Not that Syria is a paradigm, a paragon of stability right now, but again, it shows it's possible to fight back against that. And even Libya in these past couple years has really turned it around to the point where, of course, you still have the civil war ongoing. It's stalled out a lot compared to what it was in previous years, but point being is even break all their toys and go home doesn't have the sway that it used to now that there's significant both regional and great powers to rival the United States. You think the main three: Russia, China, Iran, especially when it comes to Middle Eastern issues. And again, we've seen the extent of Iran's capabilities when it comes to Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and again, the extent of Russia's capabilities when it comes to Ukraine, Syria, Libya, etc. So again, even that strategy probably can be used a few more times, but it's very short term until, again, Russia, China, or whoever decides to step in and bring some stability to the situation. And as we've seen, when that happens, especially under previous administrations from Obama onwards, there'll be things done to challenge it, such as sanctions, such as diplomatic protests, such as, again, the covert funding of X, Y, or Z group. But there isn't really going to be an effort, say, let's pick a country on the map that America try to destabilize. Let's say America tries to stabilize Lebanon next. There's stuff going on in Lebanon. Well, the minute, again, Iran or Russia or whoever steps in, you're not really going to see much significant resistance from the U.S. beyond supportive proxy groups, maybe some mercs on the
Mm.
ground. And again, they're just going to break some things, have the other guys clean up, your rivals clean up, and then go home to the point where it really becomes a counterproductive strategy because it makes these other rival powers more popular in these countries. It makes you look like the guy who just ruined everything. So, again, I see what you mean about that, but I think that's becoming a strategy with even more diminishing returns.
Yes, yeah, 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 absolutely, absolutely. And then also the question of unification. You need a populace unified to back a war. And I honestly don't think, like, there's very few theaters that I think Americans are willing to have a war on the sort of scale that we've seen the last 20 years.
I
But
will
that
say,
is,
ironically enough, I think the biggest possibility that could rally Americans to war, and that's because, and you probably at most have a decade because of this with just the way the boomer population is. If there was a direct attack on Israel from Iran or some other
yeah,
group, like actual incursions into Israel, I could see them riling up the boomers and the evangelicals
yeah.
into supporting a war, or at least a small scale military effort to support Israel, to support the IDF's defense of Israel, etc. But point being is, not much beyond that. I think, of course, if like there were some freak scenario where I don't know T90s are invading Western Germany like we're back in the Cold War, you could probably drum up significant support of the population. But the most realistic scenario is again lending military aid, boots on the ground military aid to Israel in event of a conventional attack, which again I also don't see happening just with the way
Yeah.
things have been in the Middle East. And again, it's going to be sort of like an Iraq or Afghanistan situation where you could probably get a significant enough of a chunk of the population to support the war to be on board with that, but then that fizzles out after 3 or 4 years.
Hmm. Hmm. And I still think that the idea of an incursion into Israel is further away. But I would say that after this Taliban victory, should things go better, um, I would say that the Arab Muslim population in the countries surrounding Israel are going to require more money to be suppressed, because, like, when people talk about aid to
Are you
Israel,
telling me
they're always
Bashar's going to be in the Golan Heights just riding his lion into? No, no,
but
but I see what you mean. You're talking more about, like, for example, Egypt or Jordan, aren't you?
right. And even Lebanon, right, with reference to Hezbollah, right. um like I said, this will ignite, more passion in those territories. And just to bring it back around to funding, right? When people talk about funding to Israel, they always bring up, well, I mean, Egypt gets almost as much. Yeah, but that's to buy off the politicians
Well, hey,
because
speaking of uppity Middle Eastern powers, you know who we haven't discussed in this entire equation yet? You know who's probably feeling pretty ballsy right now?
mm,
Erdogan.
Erdogan, yeah, and he got his Turkish forces at the airport. But if I could just finish,
Yes, do go ahead.
um, so basically, that money is there to suppress the population. It's to buy them off, right? And what you're seeing is a group of people who are fed up, you know, who understand that even their leadership is compromised. We talk about Ghani, and the fact is Ghani lost the election. He came in fourth, but the Americans made sure he became president. The guy who won was a guy named Abdullah, and he was made like a high-ranking minister. And so they're drawing their own parallels from this. And does America have? We talk about America having the reach. Is Money Machine go burr in order to get more money to pay off these other Arab leaders as they watch, Palestinians basically slowly being genocided. That's going to be an issue going forward.
Yeah, I
Right?
know it is a stretch, but I mean, with what we saw in Libya, is Sisi's pretty ambitious. He's pretty ambitious to make a name for Egypt, and who knows how long he stays in power or whatever. But there could just be some. I would say Egypt's probably the prime candidate for this, just based on their size and military power. As relations deteriorate, as the United States continues to retract, maybe some ambitious Egyptian general seizes power and decides that we're going to free the Palestinians or whatever. Again, that's more of like a long-term scenario. We're probably looking at a few decades down the roads before that happens. But point being is, you have a point that, of course, with America's retraction, with how easy it is to topple these American-backed regimes, that it isn't too unlikely, especially on the Israel question, that you see some sort of uprising in these countries. I mean, hell, we already saw this in Egypt in, 2013, 2014, when the Muslim Brotherhood took power after Mubarak was overthrown. So it is possible, and especially in the absence or retraction of the U.S., it also is possible. Now, how much will it take before that escalates into even a minor conflict? That, I think, is to be determined. But point being
Yeah.
is, it's the perfect storm. You have everything you need there for that situation, to get that ball rolling, so to speak.
Because in many ways, people in the Arab Muslim world, particularly in the Gulf states, but I would say also in Egypt, for instance, they look at Tel Aviv as kind of as Kabul, and the stuff that was going on there.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Sodom and
And
Gomorrah, but that's aside the
even
point.
same diff, right? Same difference, right? That's the way they look at it. Um, because to them, there's no question that that land is theirs. It belongs to them. Um, so, anyways, I mean, that's an interesting thing. I do think that's far into the future. It's like I don't even want to
Even though,
honestly
I don't want
hazard
to
a guess.
speculate, but I hate to say it, with the rate everything else we've talked about has happened so far, and that's
I
just
know.
not, that's not even Afghanistan, that's Ukraine, that's Russia, that's China, that's pretty much every topic we've talked about. Things, again, probably go at 2 or 3 times the speed than I would expect, if not faster. Which is why I don't like to
Yeah,
make these definitive predictions, which is why I like
I
to
know.
put a
I
more
don't. Yeah.
abstract timeline to these
Yeah.
things. Whereas, theoretically, I think it's probably going to take a while for the Levant, for Israel, that question to come to a head. For all we know, we could be talking about this, in a year from now. It could be September 2022. We're talking about the ex Arab-Israeli war. I think what would be the third or fourth at that point. I mean, but I'm not ruling anything out at this point. That's the position I'm going to take.
Yeah. 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 Wise choice. I'm even going to retract about far, far into the future. Who knows?
Arbitrarily
Uh,
in the future is all I'll say.
yeah. Yeah. There is actually one tiny, tiny tidbit about Afghanistan
Do tell.
and Trump as a supreme accelerationist that I did want to mention. So the upcoming president, most likely president of Afghanistan, will be Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar. Um, Trump basically argued to give this guy his freedom. It was part of a deal. I just find it ironic that Trump freed him, and now he's going to become president of Afghanistan.
I'll correct you. He's going to become Emir of Afghanistan. Okay, they're the Emirate of
Yes,
Afghanistan now.
yes, you're right. You're right. Amir, that's right. This is a
Yes,
cow.
yes,
Yeah,
the big LARP. Which I mean, is it really a LARP if you succeed? That's the question. Frankly, at that point, you're not just LARPing. You've succeeded. Which is why I more or less have an admiration for most LARPers. I'll say, you got to admire the effort. But point being is, really, I can think of no other words to put this, and ironically enough, because this took me so off guard, this is probably going to be about 10 minutes shorter than usual. We're probably going to wrap it up here in the next
yeah,
few minutes. But the thing I will say about all of this is, again, I can really see no other alternative than, yeah, this is checkmate. This is, and I hate to put time frames of things because you know how that is panned out. This is the end of the American Empire, effectively. Now, it may take longer, may take a few years or decades or whatever for that to actually manifest, or who the hell knows, it could be the next 3 years. But I mean, we passed the point of no return, I would say, with the election of Trump. I would say that's a fair timeline.
yeah,
But we've like passed the second point of no return, so to speak. We've passed the point of no return. Now we're hurtling off the cliff at this point, and it's only going down now. Of course, down depending on what perspective you look at it from. At this point, again, no love for this empire. Its collapse. I mean, until it starts to affect me materially, really means nothing to me because of the point we've gotten. And again, a lot of people, I think, actually the video by Serpkerp, which I would recommend you all check out, was pretty good, about half an hour long. It's got a lot of valuable information talking about how, again, people aren't patriotic for an empire and that they're more obsessed of, they're more, again, infatuated with the idea of the nation. I'm not attributing any views to him. I just say you should watch that video for context. But at this point, that's something we've touched on since 2018, the nation empire dichotomy. But I would say, yes, while the empire is in collapse, the idea of clinging to the American nation is clinging to a historical artifact, something that hasn't really existed in the past 50, if not 100 years, to the point where it's like, it doesn't really exist anymore. Now, can it be revived? Can some form of it be revived? I think those are questions that are yet to be answered. I think there's too many variables to say if there can be some sort of American national revival post Empire, so to speak. But again, as it stands now, the concept of America as a nation is dead. America is currently just a political entity, a polity, a state, if you will, and an empire. As a nation, it
yeah,
effectively does not exist. And I would say
yeah.
just look at the current political climate, look at the polarization, look at everything going around, and really, I think the real epitaph of the American empire is, you you conquered the world. You became, again, for what does a man profit if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? That's really the epitaph of the American empire, that we sold out everything that made America America for the temporary pursuit of global power. And people probably thought it would last longer than 70 years, but I guess not.
I mean, all you got to do is look, remember back to all the statues. I mean, they're still being toppled, but all the statues that were toppled last year. So that historic America is fading, and the
Yeah, and
census
I would
basically.
say, yeah, that's touching on the census, where 57.8% of the American population is white, and white includes
Mhm.
pretty much everything from your generic European stock, English, Irish, German, Italian, etc. But that also includes people from the Middle East and North Africa, that they're classified as Caucasians on the U.S. Census just for technical reasons, which does inflate that number, which probably pushes down to, I've seen people speculate around a 54, 55% white. But yeah, getting back to that point and tearing down the statues, I would say is less defamation, but more of a desecration of its corpse, or defiling of its grave.
Yeah, yeah. Well said. Yeah, desecration of its corpse. Very good.
But that's all I had for this episode, and I'm sure we'll probably have to make another episode this week at some point.
It's possible. Let's see what the days bring. Definitely, it's a possibility.
But we'll see you guys either later this week or next week. And thank you for tuning into this very pivotal episode of the War Report. And I'm really at a loss for words now. Like I've always enjoyed doing the show. I still enjoy doing it. I still think not to inflate our egos too much. We are doing important work just by putting some form of documentation of historical events happening out there. I don't know. Maybe in 500 years, if the technology still exists, we'll be referenced by historians. Now, wouldn't that be quite the legacy? Or maybe I'm getting delusions of grandeur. Maybe I'm getting too far ahead of myself. The point being is, look, while I do enjoy documenting the decline, while I do think we do provide a valuable but niche service, the I have to admit, and you guys can probably tell, the same sort of spirit isn't here this episode. Not that I'm dreading doing this, but this doesn't feel the same as previous episodes, even when there's these sort of pivotal events. Like I'm not even like sad or depressed or anything. I'm just I'm just baffled. That's really the only word I can put to it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I know. It feels a bit strange for myself too.
Surreal is how I'd put it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
thank you for tuning into this very surreal episode of the War Report, and we'll see you guys next time. And goodbye.
Take care.